So we've discussed on this channel plenty of times that there is an issue in this country with birth rates being massively below replacement. So replacement is about 2.1 and we're at 1.6 as birth rates dropping to 1.5. It's an all-time low. And this can be a big issue when you have an aging demographic population and a decreasing workforce and therefore a decreasing productive capacity, making your pension bill larger, reducing your economic growth. And this, of course, has a knock-on effect of making people want to have fewer children because your economic conditions decline, which then further compounds this problem. Which has also led to politicians approaching immigration policies to deal with the shortfall in population that have then caused the rise of the far right basically across Europe. Most Western states are feeling the pinch on this one, and so therefore have adopted immigration policies that are a little bit more liberal, which have caused some levels of social discohesion amongst people who don't quite like the idea of there being non-white people in their country. There's a word for people like that. Anyway, plenty of conservatives, amusingly ones who disagree with immigration on population increase grounds, are also saying that we need to increase birth rates, which is not really a position that's in any way coherent to take, but whatever, we'll leave that one for another video. They are discussing ways which we can change our country so that we can increase birth rates through economic policy. And I think we do need to have a conversation about how we can increase those birth rates through economic policy. Now, I've got two different discussions on this issue that we can have a look at today. The first one I wanted to have a look at was by a journalist called Sebastian Payne, friend of the show, part-time Will from the In-Betweeners impersonator, said that Britain urgently needs a new deal for parents. Our birth rate is collapsing and women want to have more children than they're able to. We need to tackle access to fertility treatment, childcare, housing, and the tax system. Now, what's interesting is that broad strokes, I think we do need to more access to fertility treatment. There are good childcare plans coming from both political parties in this country in terms of where we can provide childcare, and across the Western world in which birth rates are dropping because of there being more people who are looking towards careers, especially women looking to have careers, and that means you need more childcare to make up for that stuff. There's a really great video by Money&Macro, a macroeconomics YouTube channel who I highly recommend, talking about ways in which certain country can advocate for certain policies to deal with the fall in birth rate and to things like childcare provision to help those who don't want to impact their career by having children, for example. But it's interesting in that when we look at housing, when we look at the tax system, there are plenty of things that we could do, that we could definitely do to fund this childcare, to make work pay enough so that we can have enough money to be able to afford to have children. Also, that one parent can work and one parent can stay at home, so there's someone who's there to raise the children. Interestingly enough, though, I don't think Sebastian Payne will go into that. He's talked about this a lot here in terms of shrinking numbers of newborns, and that for a lot of conservatives this is an existential problem more than it is a financial problem. Because in my mind, when you make statements like Sebastian Payne has done here about women saying they're delaying having children due to fears about their finances, what you're recognising here is that poor people cannot afford to have children. Poor people can't afford to have children in this country because it costs a huge amount of money. It's incredibly expensive to have children in this country because living costs are high, because housing costs are high, and because wages have been continually depressed for 14 years. Funnily enough, though, Sebastian Payne, not mentioning wages anywhere here, none of that supply-side labour market reform coming from the Conservative Party ever makes it into his criticism of the fact that people can't afford to have kids. No, we just need to have tax cuts, don't we? We need to have tax breaks for people who want to have kids, potentially. I don't know. Either way, if we had an economy where wages were higher and CEO pay and worker pay weren't massively disparate, maybe people would have the ability to be able to afford to have children. Maybe if we had a housing system that wasn't heavily commodified and a failure of conservative policy that got us to this point in the first place, maybe people would be having more children. It's very interesting that in this very article, he talks about the idea that the people who are really feeling the pinch on this one are potentially graduates who earn £50,000 a year or more. As Jonathan Portes points out in the tweet that I shared, that it's interesting the priority is graduates earning 50k with 3 kids rather than those on benefits in or out of work subject to the 2-child limit. Of course, that's the big problem, is that we don't have a strong enough welfare state to be able to support these people. We could have more child tax credits, for example. There are plenty of things that we could do for the poorer families, but of course, those aren't the swing voters that Sebastian Payne, who works for conservative think tank UK Onward, would ever bother caring about, would ever bother actually considering in their analysis here. Now, the second person I wanted to get to in terms of their analysis of this is another actual friend of the show, a Mr. Aaron Bastani, who just wrote a new article in Novara Media. He's just become a dad. And what he says is that it's a radicalising experience. And I think for millennials, that's true. I think it's very true that it's not this age-old adage of becoming conservatives as you get older, as if you have more to protect. Because you actually have to have those things to protect in the first place. And Aaron makes this point really eloquently later on in the article, in the function of the Gen Xers having kids and becoming way more conservative once they have the assets to protect is a function of how much money they actually have and how many assets they have as a result of the private sector gains of the Thatcher era, all of the low interest rates for them to get onto the housing ladder, all of the economic booms of the Blair years, all of those interest-only buy-to-let mortgages that they would have had access to and things like that. And that is a function of things like right to buy as well. So when they have all these assets, they have these better pensions, they have all of this capital that they want to protect. Their fundamental thing they want to do is to pass that down to their children. They want to create the better world for their kids specifically, which of course means conservative economic viewpoints of protecting their own existing wealth. Yet for millennials, as Aaron's pointing out in this particular article, far more likely to live with their parents, far more likely to rent rather than own, no assets, bad pensions, a completely different economic situation. And when you can't have kids, you can't afford to have kids because of those situations, or you have kids unexpectedly, and then you find it very difficult to afford that because of the economic situation that you're in that's been created by continual year upon year upon year economic policy specifically to benefit the Gen Xers who are becoming very, very conservative. That's going to radicalise you to the left. I have a friend called Josh. He's a Marine, and he'd voted non-Labour all of his life, right? I mean, the culture is very, very anti-Labour. He told me stories about people having Jeremy Corbyn's face on targets when he was doing training. But he voted Labour for the very first time in 2017 because of being convinced by us, or might have been 2019. And his resolution of this was, well, had a kid, and that changed my view of the world. What kind of world am I bequeathing to my child? What kind of world can I create for my child, living for the best possible world for them to grow up in, the best opportunities to give them? And this world that we've created that protects the assets that we're gifted to older generations that have more than we do, that's not going to help that guy's kid. It's not going to help us have more kids moving forward at the generations. It's not going to empower the poorer people in society who find it very, very difficult to create families, who are living in rented accommodation, living with their parents, right? These people are not having children until they're way, way older than they were previously. In 97, the most common arrangement for young adults was living together in a couple with children. That very same demographic now are living with their parents in majority, in plurality. And that's a failure of conservative neoliberal economics that has commodified housing after we sold off all the council housing, that's put all of the money into the hands of CEOs and the ultra-wealthy rather than redistributing it to create equitable society for all, that's worse public services, that means that all of the things that are necessary for you to be able to ensure that all of the things that are necessary to be able to raise a family are there for you. It's all gone. It's all gone for us. It was there for the previous generations that have become way more conservative as they've had kids. For us, though, the complete opposite has happened. And if you can't afford to buy a home, if you can't afford to be able to put food on the table, if you can't afford to plan for the future, to have that pension for you later, you're not going to make that decision to have children. You're not going to be able to make that decision to create that future, even though all the polling shows that people want to have more kids than they are currently having. The issue with our birth rates is not one of choice. The issue with our birth rates is not one of the fact that people are making a cultural decision not to have more kids. It's because people want to have them and they cannot afford to do that. Huge amounts of them are having financial troubles. And sure, tax credits, more state money being ploughed into the favours of the private sector is a thing that you could do. And I'm not necessarily opposed to more childcare measures. I'm not necessarily opposed to that. But there is one thing that we should be doing, fighting for higher wages. Fighting for better housing policy, more council houses, the most stable housing that you can have is a council house. The most stable house you can build, you can raise your child in, is a council house. It's the most stable way of doing it because you know that you're going to have access to that housing publicly and you're not going to have to worry about failing to pay the mortgage, for example, if you're in a council house. And that is what we built what this country built in the post-war period that got torn up by the Thatcherite government to be able to enrich the generations who now want to protect that wealth. And that's the big difference. That's why having this child in the same kind of realm of how it might affect your politics, depending on your own material conditions, can be vastly, vastly changing of how you would change your politics in response to that experience. And these differences in the way that people approach these things, from Sebastian Payne looking at £50,000 earning graduates or whatever it is, versus Aaron Bastani, the personal experience of someone who earns 30k, raising a child, seeing the world that's been brought up in from our generation, I think that stark difference is very, very interesting. And I would highly recommend people to go and read Aaron's article about this. I will link it in the description. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.